Good morning or afternoon, depending upon where you are in the country today, and welcome to Live with Lewis for the 21st of October, 2004. We're happy to have you joining us today. We're coming to you live, as you can see in the shot there in front of you, from the banks of the Missouri River. We're at a place called Kimball Bottom, known locally as the Desert, just about 10 miles south of Bismarck, North Dakota. Once again, thank you for joining us for Live with Lewis for the 21st of October, 2004. And we want to get a little bit of our business out of the way to begin with. We welcome all of our internet viewers today if you're watching us live, or if you're watching us on an archived version of this at some point in the future. We encourage you to send your questions and comments to Lewis and Clark at clayton.k12.mo.us. That's Lewis and Clark, LEWISANDCLARK, at Clayton, CLAYTON.mo.us.K12. And we want to, once again, that's Lewis and Clark at clayton.k12.mo.us. And we thank you for joining us for today's broadcast. If we can answer those questions during today's show, we will, and otherwise we'll try to answer them online via email. We want to do as usual. We're going to start today's program talking about what happened to the original expedition 200 years ago. You may remember we came to you last week from Fort Yates, and when we were at Fort Yates last week, we wanted to we talked a little bit about some of the river conditions there. Fort Yates was at the border of North Dakota and South Dakota. And we've passed into North Dakota officially since we came to you last from that location. You might remember it was a rather blustery day there, and some of you who watched that broadcast may remember the tumbleweeds as they were blowing across the sandbars that fill the river along this region. And we have moved our operation now up to the Bismarck area in preparation for the Circle of Culture's National Signature event, which will begin tomorrow here in Bismarck at the University of Mary. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that later with our guest Tracy Potter, author and director of the signature event. So we're eager to get to that portion of the broadcast. We'll start today's broadcast by talking about what happened in the journals 200 years ago. And for those of you who are following the journals, you may know that this was an interesting portion this past week. Some of the things that happened to the expedition. They passed through an area, as we have been doing, through an area where the terrain features between South Dakota and North Dakota do change dramatically. The high elevation and hills along the river once we get into North Dakota change quite remarkably from those that we were used to in South Dakota. The original expedition made note of these different types of terrain formations. Also, probably most fundamentally, the Corps 200 years ago passed from the area that was largely the Sioux homeland into the area of the Arikara and into where we are now, which was the homeland of the Mandan and the Mandan people, Hidatsa Mandan, and we're going to be talking more about those folks not only this year, but as we begin our expedition next year and we make our way out of Bismarck west and continuing on up the Missouri River. But the Corps 200 years ago made note of a lot of the things that they were seeing along the way, of course, and not the least of those was the Arikara villages. One of the things that has happened as we've made our way into this area is that the permanent villages that the Arikara and the Mandan lived in are becoming prominent terrain features for the original expedition. They're learning a great deal about the socio-political dynamic that took place here in the years preceding their arrival in this area. One of the most remarkable things is the accounts that the Arikara chiefs that they meet along the way and some of the Arikara people that they meet along the way share with them. They talk about the fact that they had to relocate many of their villages and even make defensive stands, as it were, against, as the Arikara characterized them, the troublesome Sioux. The Sioux had been pushing the Arikara further and further north, and so they had abandoned a number of their villages, and Lewis and Clark make note of that in their journals, talking about the abandoned village sites, and they had the good fortune of spending time with Arikara chiefs and members of the Arikara Nation as they moved through, who shared with them stories of how they had to move repetitively to escape the offensive actions of the Sioux, who continued to harass them and push them into a further hunting ground. And of course the dynamics of the plains were very much a part of the history of this area long before Lewis and Clark arrived. And while they record some of those things, We're going to learn even more about that today and over the next few weeks as we come into this fundamentally different area. The Sioux, of course, were teepee dwellers largely, and we're moving into an area of more sedentary tribes. The Arikara, the Hidatsa Mandan, were earth lodge dwellers, and we're going to, over the next couple of weeks, see many of those villages. In fact, next week we'll be broadcasting to you from a village on a slant, which is located adjacent to Fort Lincoln, just across the river, about 10 miles above us, just below Bismarck. And so we'll have an opportunity to share those things with you. As well, the original expedition talks about some animals that they're starting to encounter here for the first time. Probably the most noteworthy was Pierre Cruzat just this past week on the original expedition, shot one of the great white bears that they had heard so much about, the grizzly bear as we would know it today. And while he wounded that bear, he talks about the fact that after in the journals, Clark records the fact that Cruzat shot and wounded the bear, and then evidently concerned about the imposing, intimidating nature of that animal, threw down his rifle and tomahawk and ran away. And Cruzat had quite a day that day. After returning to the place where he had shot the grizzly bear, he did recover his weapon and tomahawk, and then later that day went hunting, and he shot a buffalo cow, who, while he broke its leg with the round that he fired at it, it did not bring the animal down, and the animal proceeded to chase him for a while. So Peter Cruzat, as they record him in the journals for that day, had quite a day himself in this past week, as he encountered two large animals indigenous to this area, the white bear and the buffalo. Of course, the buffalo are still to be seen in this area. There are a number of buffalo ranches and farms in this area, but of course the grizzly bear is no longer present in these climes, and so we will not have an opportunity probably to show you footage of a grizzly bear. However, you may see some more footage of buffalo as we proceed up the river over the next few weeks. Now we're going to talk about a little bit about our experiences over the past week, and at this time we'll go ahead and have Jim go to the B-roll, and we'll take a look at some of the footage. And here you can see down at Walker Bottom, just above Fort Yates, actually on the Standing Rock Reservation. We're taking time on the morning we're leaving there to present some medals and to thank the South Dakota National Guard, which left us there and turned us over to the North Dakota National Guard as far as our support team goes. And here we are with Sergeant Major Jerry Pope, and there's Sergeant Major Verway on the left there facing us of the North Dakota National Guard. And the National Guard has been extremely helpful. There's General Carpenter on the far left there from South Dakota, and we were very honored to be presented there with a eagle from the Adjutant General of South Dakota, General Borman. We appreciate that. And here I am with the Assistant Adjutant General of North Dakota, and we've been just very thankful for all the assistance we've received from both of the South Dakota and North Dakota Guard. And here we are taking off from Walker Bottom in the Pirogues. It's a very, very swift current in a very constricted, channelized area there, naturally channelized. It's not a man-made channel there, but the river is low and is returning to its old riverbed, and the river is quite swift here. And we actually moved out that morning with the North Dakota National Guard, the bridge company from this area, brought two of their bridge boats out, which are the small boats that they use to construct pontoon bridges. And many of these folks have been deployed overseas in Iraq, and there you can see them, and they've returned home recently. Many of you may remember the footage of the South Dakota Bridge Company, who had also returned from Iraq recently. And we spent the next day about 37 miles on the river this day with the guard boats moving with us, and this was a pretty treacherous part of the river. As you can see there, the water is very low, and you can see the trees in the background that are now exposed. All of those trees just a few years ago would have been underwater, and there's a still photo of the boats moving up the river through this treacherous part of the Missouri. And of course, one of the things that happened this week for us was snow. We woke up just the other day at the dock where we have the keel boat right now, over at South Point Marina near Fox Island Recreation Area, and we woke up with the keel boat covered in snow, and it was actually a delightful day by the end of the day. And you can see here later in the day we prepared to tent the boat and raise the mast, and while there's just a small contingent of us were there with the keel boat at that time, we struggled to put the mast up and were successful in that. 4 of us got the mast up and got the boat tented, and this was a nice opportunity for us to go through sort of a drill of what we've been doing for so long. And it's been sort of a bittersweet week for us as we look back on the many, many months between last year and this year that we have spent with the keelboat Columbia as we've made our way here from Elizabeth, Pennsylvania, some 2,800 miles now that we have come across the country on horse and water. And here we are tending the boat. And as I mentioned, it's been somewhat of a bittersweet week for us as we look back at this last couple of weeks that we'll be with the keelboat. The keelboat, of course, returns historically next year to St. Louis, and the pirogues will continue on. But for those of us who are moving on westward, these next couple of days and the next couple of weeks really mark the end of our time with the keelboat Columbia. And it's been our home for so very long, and we're sort of sad about the time coming to an end. There's Brian Boswell setting our ground camp at Kimball Bottoms, and here you see the two pirogues, which are currently moored at Kimball Bottom along this very beautiful and nearly pristine portion of the Missouri River. And of course, there, another shot from our camp at Kimball Bottom. And some people might be surprised to see, but that's a stovepipe there. And curiously enough, the original expedition did have some wood-burning stoves with them. This was a modern one that we just acquired the other day. And so the fellows who have been in the ground camp have had a little bit of heat over the last few days as well. So the expedition is coming to nearing its end for this year as we approach Fort Mandan. We're just about 70 miles below Fort Mandan in the town of Washburn, North Dakota, and we'll be making our way up that way over the next couple of weeks. So that's what's happened to the Discovery Expedition over the past week, and give you a little oversight of what was happening with the original expedition 200 years ago. They, of course, were always in an area where they were meeting, in fact, all the way up to this point. It's curious, they continue to meet people of European descent. There were Europeans who had been in this area for quite some time, traders and trappers and that sort of thing. And just this past week, historically, 200 years ago, the expedition was continuing to meet local people who had spent much time with the Arikara, Hidatsa Mandan, were permanent traders in this area and had long established relationships with those tribes. And again, it's important that we understand that Lewis and Clark were not the first Europeans to come to this area, that there had been ongoing trade, and we'll talk about that. We've talked about it in the past. We'll continue to talk about the long-standing trade that particularly the Mandan, the Mandan villages, of course, were about as far as the Europeans had made their way, and as far as commercial trade and that sort of thing. But it's important, again, to remember that the Hidatsa Mandan, the Arikara, the Sioux, all of the nations which inhabited the Missouri River Valley had been engaged for nearly 100 years or so in trade with Europe via these traders and trappers that made their way up the Missouri River. Today we're joined by another gentleman of European descent who, however, is a very instrumental in telling the story of the Mandan, and one particular individual in no small part, and we're joined today by Tracy Potter. Tracy, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Tracy, in addition to, we're going to tell you a little bit about Tracy so people understand who it is we're being visited by today, but in addition to being an author of an important book, a book particularly important to the Bicentennial, Tracy is also, please correct me if I'm wrong, but is it executive director of the signature event?
I'm the executive director of the Fort Abraham Lincoln Foundation, and the foundation is running the signature event, has organized it.
And the signature event, this will be the last signature event that we'll participate in this year, and we're very pleased to be here, and I know it's been a big undertaking. First of all, let's talk about a couple of things. Next week we're going to be at Fort Lincoln, so we'll save a little bit of that for next week as we share that with the folks. But the Fort Lincoln nearby here was a cavalry post, Custer's last command. And it's also located, interestingly enough, adjacent to Village on a Slant, which Lewis and Clark record.
That's right. That village was probably inhabited by the Mandan. It was a planned community that they moved into someplace around 1575, and they lived there for a little over 200 years and vacated the site 100 years before George Custer moved in.
Okay, and probably a good thing for both of them.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think, and we're going to, again, as I mentioned, we're going to learn a great deal more about Fort Lincoln next week. But the two things we'd like to talk to you about today really are, first of all, let's talk about the signature event. Okay. Our viewers have followed us across the country, and the signature events, they've all had a different feel to them. Tell us a little bit about your signature event. The name of it's the Circle of Cultures. Tell us a little bit about that and what's planned for this week here.
The whole concept of the event was to turn the Lewis and Clark expedition around, and rather than looking at Lewis and Clark directly, we wanted to look at the cultures that they found. And so really this event started to be about the Mandan Indians and that contact between Lewis and Clark and the Mandan that took place here 200 years ago. And then as well the other Earth Lodge peoples, the Hidatsa and the Arikara, who are all now inhabitants of the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, and they're known as the three affiliated tribes. So we wanted to focus on their cultures and the way that they greeted and hosted Lewis and Clark, and the warm welcome really that the Mandan gave them. And that's what the event's like. We have Amy Mossett, a member of the three affiliated tribes and the Circle of Tribal Advisors, as one of our speakers. Gerard Baker, another Mandan Hidatsa, Keith Bear, and then the scholars that we've brought in, like James Ronda and Dayton Duncan. They'll be referencing, looking at things from the Indians' point of view. James Ronda's talk, for instance, is Black Cat's World. And so we're really attempting to focus on the richness of those cultures of the Earth Lodge peoples.
Okay, and the actual event begins tomorrow, and we'll run through how long is it? Because you've got the events planned for well over a week here, don't you?
It's a 10-day event. It was pretty ambitious of us to take it on. It starts Friday at noon, and we'll have all the dignitaries of North Dakota, our entire congressional delegation. Senator Dorgan has been so forthcoming with funds to help us put this on. Governor John Hoeven will lead it. Our mayor, the head of the University of Mary. That's where we're holding it. It's on these beautiful bluffs at the University of Mary overlooking the Missouri River, so that as people come out, we've actually built a little Earth Lodge village there of 4 lodges, and as people walk out to those lodges, they'll get to see the scene, much like Lewis and Clark saw 200 years ago, this really unspoiled river valley. Sometimes you have to look so you don't see the houses or the power lines and things, but really it's a gorgeous sight, and it looks like we've been pretty lucky with the weather. You had snow, but now it's broken, We told people right off the bat, they said, what'll people from Washington calling and saying, well, what's the weather going to be like? I said, well, we guarantee 3 seasons at least while you're here. We've already had the winter, so now we're hoping for the summer and the Indian summer.
They talked about the event taking place at University of Mary. This is a little bit different. In fact, probably I guess we've been to all the signature events as we've moved across the country, and this one is probably most like the one, at least from my perspective, most like the one that started the Bicentennial at Monticello. It definitely has a more academic feel to it, and even with regard to its location, it's not located on the riverfront. It's located actually a pretty good distance. As you mentioned, you can see the river from that. In fact, we hope to move the boats by there on Sunday so people can see that. But the academic aspect of it, was that a primary focus for you?
Yeah, we attended Monticello, and we're very impressed with the lineup of speakers and things, and of course that's what we wanted to bring to this, was the best scholarship in the world. In fact, we said, well, we have everything Monticello has in parking too. Although parking isn't that, it could be that it's busy, but we do have space here. We wanted to be on a university campus as opposed to right on the riverbank for a couple of reasons. So many of the signature events have had their opening ceremonies dampened, let's say. The enthusiasm dampened literally, by the weather, and we wanted to make sure that we had indoors. It is October in North Dakota, and the weather is unpredictable. We could have snow, we could have 80 degrees, we could have both.
Before we move on and talk about your book, you mentioned the Earth Lodges that were built up there, and I'd be remiss to not, as a member of the National Guard, I'd be remiss to not bring this up. Tell us a little bit about how those Earth Lodges came to be.
Thanks for that opportunity. Yes, first off, we received a federal grant, a National Park Service grant that was directed again by Senator Dorgan's work in the Interior Subcommittee. And then the North Dakota National Guard came forward and said, you need some help? And he said, yeah, you're our labor force. And so they've been just phenomenal. They've helped us at Fort Lincoln in a number of projects. Last year they helped us build a stable there, and now this year those 4 Earth Lodges, plus they're providing all the tactical, logistical support for the Circle of Cultures. We love these guys.
Now the Earth Lodges, that was an IRT project, wasn't it?
That's correct.
And just for our viewers to understand a little bit more about the IRT projects, the National Guard has made some pretty progressive, has adopted pretty progressive attitudes about these sorts of things. Rather than having soldiers engaged in training that doesn't necessarily produce anything, one of the great things about the IRT projects is that they actually give soldiers some real outcomes. There is a final product, as it were, when they go out to move sand. A lot of these folks, rather than just pushing a pile of sand or dirt around for the sake of getting familiar with the equipment, there's actually an outcome, and that's what this project was, I assume.
Yeah, it was great. It was about a $500,000 project to rebuild on a historic site a stable that was completely authentic to the 7th Cavalry. And without the National Guard's assistance, we would have been in real trouble. And I remember when you showed a picture there of Master Sergeant Verve earlier, and when he came to my office the first time and was talking about projects, and I had this idea that, they'll move dirt around. And he said, we also do vertical projects. And that's when the lights went off. And we went, vertical? Oh, that means we could have something built. That'd be great. And so they did. They built us a 9-foot tall vertical, stable, and 210 feet long and 28 feet wide. And then with these earth lodges, they're learning techniques that are ancient techniques of how to build things. But I hope they'll have some modern applications for them.
Well, it is. I know that the men that I've spoken with and the individuals that I've spoken with that have been involved in those projects have found them very satisfying, and it's been a labor of love as much as anything else. And I will tell you, because he's in the audience today here with us, it's Command Sergeant Major Verway. So we want to make sure that we don't slight him in any regard, or we'll both be on KP later.
We know he's the boss.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about your book, and there have been so many books written about tangential to the story of Lewis and Clark. And yours, in many ways, as probably maybe some of Rhonda's book, Lewis and Clark Among the Indians, and James Tom's book, Sign Talker. These books have made a foray into the story of Native Americans who played a particular role in the story of Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery. But yours is a little bit different. I mean, it's more of a biography, really, isn't it?
It is, although, the amount of information that was written about this character would have been a 5-page biography, and so it has to be fleshed out with ethnology. So we take the best students of Mandan culture over the many years, from Lewis and Clark are in there, and La Verandry and David Thompson, and up to Maximilian and Catlin, and try to put some flesh on those bones, on that very brief statement.
But before we go any further, can you show us the book and just if you would just introduce the book as you?
Yeah, this is the story of Sheheke. Sheheke Shot is his Mandan name, White Coyote, and he was the Mandan Indian chief of the village of Minnetonka, the first Mandan village that was visited by Lewis and Clark. He's the one who famously said on November 1st, 1804, "If we eat, you shall eat. If we starve, you must starve also." And he pretty much knew they were going to eat, because he proved good to his word. He took them hunting, he brought them food, he facilitated the trade. He really shaped that warm welcome that the Mandan had for Lewis and Clark.
And 40 guys in a community of 6,000 was not going to make a tremendous impact, probably.
Yeah, but there were 40 guys with guns, and so that was a nice thing too, to have these as allies as opposed to any kind of enemy or standoffishness. The Mandan had a tradition of hospitality. You came to their villages, you were fed. Lewis and Clark probably missed a bet by not staying with them. In fact, they could have eaten all winter for free, but as it was, of course, they traded, and the trade was mutually beneficial. But he really did. He shaped the response to the Corps, and he reached out, I think, to become an ally of the United States. I think he was born at Honest Land Village here before the smallpox epidemic that devastated the Mandan in 1781, devastated the whole Great Plains, but particularly hit those urban Indians like the Mandan. And I believe that he was reaching for an alliance with somebody that could help restore the Mandan to the position of primacy that they'd had in this region. And these Americans looked like they could be pretty useful allies. They brought that boat up the river. Nobody else had been able to do anything nearly like that. All the trade really was with Canada. And so here we are with this keel boat and all these trade goods coming up the river. I think they said, Sheheke and his people said, these would make useful allies. And so he reached out to them to become that.
And when Lewis and Clark arrived here, they arrived here in the midst of a relatively, there was a tumultuous time. I mean, there were issues with the Arikara and even with the Sioux that the Mandan were dealing with, weren't there?
Yeah, the Arikara and the Mandan had probably fought intermittently for 5 centuries by that time. The Sioux had moved to the plains a little bit later, but they had been very troublesome to the Mandan people, and in fact had changed their lifeways to some extent. They started hunting closer to home rather than going out on the long buffalo hunts, and you see those changes through anthropology, archaeology, and so yes, there was trouble. They had moved in with the Hidatsa for mutual defense, but the
Mandan.
The Mandan had, and I think they found that a little uncomfortable. There were some tensions there between the Mandan and Hidatsa. Today it's a hyphenated word, Mandan and Hidatsa, but in those days they were two peoples, and I think that the Mandan leadership saw maybe these Americans can help us become stronger. And of course, Sheheke then he did prove to be their friend. When they came back in 2006, if we can jump ahead, or in 1806 when they came back, they were looking for a chief to return to Washington and meet President Jefferson. It was the last thing on the to-do list, and they asked LeBourne, the great Hidatsa leader, the war leader of the Hidatsa, if he'd go, and he said, "I'd like to, but the Sioux will kill me if I travel with you lower on the river." They asked Black Cat, whose perspicacity Clark so admired, and he said exactly the same thing. And Sheheke agreed to go, took his wife.
On that note, let's stop for just a moment and check. Do we have any internet questions? Oh, well, I'll tell you, we'll go ahead and answer it. We'll go ahead and answer it. And first of all, we want to say hello to everyone who's watching. Tim Gore is out in Montana, where I am actually a member of the Montana National Guard. And hello to everybody in Montana, and especially those of you who are at the MEA MFT conference. And I want to say hi to all of you out there, and hope that this is proving to be a productive learning opportunity for you. And we certainly hope that if you find this interesting and you'd like to get your students involved over the next couple of years as we continue our progression to the ocean and back, passing through the Missouri River Valley, and ultimately over the mountains to the ocean down the Columbia. We hope that you'll speak with Tim there and find out more about how you can get your students involved. A couple of questions are: what are you wearing on your head? That would be a hat. And it is actually a light infantry helmet. Lewis was light infantry. He most of his duties were conducted mounted, and this was a hat that he would have had in his possession. And it's actually quite a serviceable helmet. When I made my ride from Washington D.C. to Pittsburgh, as Lewis had done last year, I frequently used this hat to water the horse. It is indeed a helmet. It is made out of leather. It has black bear on top, indicating infantry, and the white deer plume, which was indicative of the 1st U.S. Infantry in 1803. Of course, when Lewis said goodbye to Jefferson. So that is what I am wearing, I am in fatigue uniform. I am always dressed in the uniform of the 1st U.S. Infantry, 1803, while we're conducting this expedition. So that's what I'm wearing, and that's why I'm wearing it. And proud to wear the uniform of 1803 as well as the contemporary uniform. I think those are our only questions right now. But let's turn back to your book and talk a little bit more about Sheheke, and really I think we can turn to the journals and find out a great deal about the experiences that Lewis and Clark had with him and the people in the village. But let's talk about what happened once he got on the boat in 1806 and started going back, because this is really a monumental thing for him to go back and meet with the leader of the United States. And one of the things that we've talked about a great deal as we've made our way up the river is that there was in 1800, we've talked about the issue of the Louisiana Purchase and the fact that it really simply allowed us the right to begin negotiations with these sovereign nations. So what was the dynamic when he returned to Washington, D.C.? Certainly he was greeted as the head of state, wasn't he?
He really was. In fact, he was referred to in some of the newspapers at the time as the Mandan King, which misunderstands Mandan culture. They didn't have a king. In fact, he wasn't even a hereditary leader. He was chosen by the elders to be the chief, the civil chief, because of his compassion, generosity. The subtitle of the book is Mandan Indian Diplomat, because I believe that that's what's essential about this trip that he took to Washington. Not only did he counsel with President Jefferson, if that's the phrase, it's a pretty one-sided counsel by the only accounts that exist are, of course, what Jefferson said to him.
Right.
We don't know what he said back. What Jefferson said to him is, if you Indians practiced agriculture and peace, there'd be more of you. And of course, he's telling this to people who were reputed to be peaceful and agricultural for 500-600 years, longer. But he also counseled with other Indian peoples along the way. On the trip down, right at the Grand River, they stopped and they met with the Arikara and talked with them, who they had been at war with for a long time.
The beginning of a lasting peace.
It it didn't last forever, but yes, it really did help solidify that relationship between those two. The Cheyenne were there. They counseled with the Cheyenne, who they had sometimes had conflicts with and sometimes traded with. On the return trip, which we might get to, he counseled with Omaha Indians and other peoples, and all the accounts were that he was a statesman. In fact, again, from one of this kind of ethnocentric point of view of the white observers, they thought, well, he must have learned his statesmanship from Jefferson, from the time he spent in Washington. Well, my take is a little different. I think he was born to be a statesman, and he'd learned that in his 40 years as chief, or in his 40-year life at the villages.
So when he makes the trip, and this is an interesting thing as well, when he makes the trip downriver, what was the perspective from the rest of the tribe? I mean, was there an anticipation that, he was going on an expedition of his own, really, and so what was the take of the tribe when he left?
It's a great question, and speculation is the only answer that I can give you. But one thing that in the journals you'll see, he was not the first Indian that said he would go along. Well, actually, there was a young man that Black Cat said, nobody will go with you, and this young man jumped up and said, I will, and Black Cat said, oh, he's unreliable, don't go with him. But Little Raven, or Little Crow, the other chief, the war chief of Minnetonka, agreed to go, and then changed his mind. And I have to believe that this was a council decision, that the elders had discussed this, and they decided that if a chief's going to go, if somebody's going to go, maybe it should be our talker, our diplomat, our civil chief, as opposed to the guy who we need every day around here, which is the war chief. And so I think that's why Sheheke went. It was risky. All the other chiefs had said it was risky, and it was risky. But I believe that they decided that it was worth the effort. It was worth the risk of losing one very talkative chief and perhaps gaining a permanent alliance, which of course, in fact, took place. Between the Mandan and the United States, there is no evidence of violence, conflict, anything. Our relations have been peaceful, as I say in all my talks, peaceful right from the time Lewis and Clark met them to the time that we closed Garrison Dam and flooded their land.
Absolutely. In fact, that's something I was going to ask you about. That is correct, isn't it? That of all the sovereign nations, indigenous sovereign nations, the Mandan are the one nation that has never warred with the United States.
That's exactly right.
And that is remarkable, probably from different perspectives, remarkable for different reasons, I assume. But what do we know? As you mentioned the accounts of the conversation that took place there being somewhat one-sided, but what do we know about Sheheke in terms of how he was received in his experience in D.C.? Do we know a great deal about his experiences when he was back on the East Coast?
A little bit. He was quite a celebrity in Washington when he showed up. As I say, the newspapers advertised that he would be at the theater, and they said, in fact, he will dance. The great Indian Calumet dance. Well, he was much too dignified to act.
No one asked him about that.
He didn't do that. He went up on stage, he sat in a chair, and he watched other Indians dance with a very dignified manner, they say. He surprised some people. He surprised an English diplomat, because he learned that Sheheke was monogamous. He had one wife, Yellowcorn, who went with him on the trip, along with their son, White Painted House. And this was a surprise to them. Outside of Washington, however, he seems to have traveled virtually incognito. We know he went to Philadelphia. His picture was drawn in Philadelphia, and we know that.
Was that a Peel? Did Peel do that?
No, this is St. Mamine.
Oh, okay.
Who also did Lewis, I think, at one time. He did Yellowcorn, who's in the book. In fact, it's the only image of an Indian woman met by Lewis and Clark is in here. But there was no other information. The newspapers are devoid of it. If he went to New York, the newspapers are devoid of it. So outside of Washington, he doesn't appear to have the celebrity. But there he was a big deal.
And on the return trip, coming back to the village, what was the outcome as far as what would have his comment to his people been upon his return?
Well, first off, his return, if we have the time, is very troublesome. By the time they reached the Arikara, they were in trouble. And the initial story that I had heard was the man.
He was coming back with Pryor.
He was coming back with now Ensign Pryor. Sergeant Pryor had gotten his promotion, and a small party. When they reached the Arikara, they found that the Arikara were riled up. The initial story I had heard was that the Mandan and Arikara were now at war, which may be true, but what was significant was the Arikara and the United States were at war. The United States just didn't know it yet. and it was over the Arikara chief who had gone back with the keelboat and died in Washington, and so it was a nasty scene there, and 4 Americans were killed at the Grand River in a battle with the Arikara trying to return him.
And the Arikara believed that their chief that his death was conspiratorial, that there had been some underhanded behavior there.
That may be. They likely did. They certainly believed that they should get some kind of payment, some apology other than a letter from Jefferson, and they should certainly return the body, and they didn't return the body. Jefferson said that they buried him with his family, with the Jefferson family. So it was trouble. Eventually, when he did make it home, which is now he was 3 years gone. He left in August of 1806, and he returned in September of 1809. When he finally made it home, he was received with wild exultations by his people of Minnetonka. They thought he had done the remarkable. He had done what the other chiefs had failed to do or refused to do, and he had returned. He'd even done some diplomacy on the way home. There was a village of disgruntled Mandan that he convinced to return with him, and he had all these fur traders with all these goods, and it was a remarkable thing. In fact, one of the fur traders noted in his journal he was a little put off because they're paying so much attention to this Indian and none to us, in his village. But in the other villages, he was not so well received. And there's conflict that brewed with the Hidatsa, and I think it was a competition for status. As his status was rising, LeBourne's status was necessarily declining, and LeBourne came to hate Sheheke and said nasty things about him, and eventually Sheheke was killed in a battle with Hidatsa Indians in 1812.
Well, thank you very much. I'll tell you what, let's see, we've got, I'm getting past a message here. Next week, our video conference, just a little piece of business, will come to you from the Tinamini Voices, and it's going to deal with music and the expedition. We're also going to have a lot of footage by that time of Fort Lincoln, and we'll be able to show folks the facility there at Fort Lincoln. In closing, is there, and this is, I think, one of the important things as we sort of wrap this up with regard to Sheheke, what would you tell in fact, we were very fortunate today to have a group of educators out in Montana who are watching this, and I think Sheheke is indicative of a whole host of Native American leaders who have escaped the scrutiny of the American academia. And so what would you say to folks who are watching, educators who are watching, how do they get their students, both native and non-native, to delve deeper into the story of these great and important characters in the history of this continent, not simply this nation, because Sheheke is but one of many individuals who played significant roles not only in relationship to this expedition, but in relationship to the development of the pre-Eurocentric cultures that came along. And so how do we get not only kids, but really, quite frankly, the educators as well, who are responsible for making resources available to students? How do we get them to do that? Where do they begin?
Sure. I don't think it's easy. I don't think it's impossible. And I don't want to say, gee, I found the method. But there have been reviews of the book that say he's approached this problem in a way that allows us to solve it. And that is, you take this little bit of information that is in white documentation, you try to blend with that whatever oral tradition still exists about this and have them make sense. Sometimes the oral tradition, one thing about oral tradition, it doesn't improve with age. Sometimes it's a little bit off. For instance, the story of his grandson about him is that Lewis and Clark never did go to the Pacific coast. They stayed with the Mandan and then went back home after he'd healed their...
sort of the flight to the moon.
Precisely. I use that analogy all the time. That was done in the sound studio.
Of course, it's important to remember also that the white perspective oftentimes is skewed through Eurocentric paternalism and that sort of thing.
Of course it is, and we imbue the Indian peoples with motivations that they may never have had, and that's what the worry that I have is that I'm projecting my own feelings onto this character that I'm doing a biography.
How has your book been received in the Mandan community?
Actually, very well. Very well. I've been in the tribal council chambers, and the chairman has praised it. I have had a person say to me, "Why? You're a white guy. How can you write about us? You shouldn't. You have no right." And of course, I say, "Well, you have every right to write about me. And so,
Well, now, how would someone go about getting a copy of your book? Is it available widely?
yeah, it's on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. You can pick it up it's a pretty good seller in North Dakota. And if we could just get it reviewed by the New York Times, we'd be home.
Well, maybe this will be a start. So, and where do we go for right now? We've got some websites you could share with us today. We've got the Fort Lincoln's got a website, I'm sure. So the Circle of Cultures. Could you tell us a little bit about that so our viewers could find out more?
Real easy. FortLincoln.com and CircleOfCultures.com. All run together. And Circle of Cultures, you'll find the schedule for this event, which is as it prints out. Wow. We've got a dozen things you should be doing all at the same time. My wife was looking at it last night. She was mad at me. She says, "But I want to go to Keith Bear. I want to go to Amy Mossett. I want to go to Brian Bittner's Earth Lodge thing." So,
well, I was just handed a copy of the schedule, and as you can see, it's thick and pretty detailed. So I don't think we'll have time to go through all of this, but we certainly appreciate you being here with us today. Any final words? Any last thing you'd like to share with our audience?
the weather is supposed to be really nice for the coming week. So come on out to the University of Mary and just enjoy the celebration of Mandan Indian culture, Hidatsa and Arikara Earth Lodge people's culture.
Well, excellent, and thank you. Of course, our satellite broadcast goes out at across the nation, and folks may not be able to make it here, but there is such a tremendous amount of things to do in this area. There's a real convergence of history here, both the native history with the Arikara, Hidatsa, Mandan. Just above town is the Double Ditch Village, which Lewis and Clark passed. There is a tremendous amount of American history here with regard to the Fort Lincoln just across the way. And if you have an opportunity to travel the trail, maybe you're traveling it next year with your family, or you're a teacher who's thinking about traveling the trail, make sure that you take time to stop in Bismarck. And actually, one place that I've got to mention before we get off the air here is the place, Tracy, the place where you work is phenomenal. Your office is over on the Mandan side of here, just across the river from Bismarck, and what a neat place. I guess it's a multifaceted facility. It's a Native American art store, information, tourism, and the whole bit.
Yeah, I'm very lucky. I've got an old railroad depot as my office, and we have Five Nations Arts, which sells the art of the local Native population from Standing Rock and Fort Berthold and Spirit Lake, and we're pretty proud of it, and it's a nice place to spend some time.
Well, it's understandable why the original expedition spent so much time here. There's a lot to do in Bismarck, and again, we thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. And we've had the opportunity to see a great deal of the community, everywhere from Fox Island over by the South Point Marina, where the keel boat is currently, and the two pirogues here at Kimball Bottom with our camp here. All of these different aspects of the expedition will be converging on Fort Lincoln, Village on a Slant, next week. On Sunday, we'll be making our way past the University of Mary, where the folks at the signature event will be able to see us from the high bluff tops there. We've enjoyed our time here, and next week, of course, we'll still be in the Bismarck area. Thank you all so much for joining us. If you didn't get a chance to get your questions and comments in today, please send them to Lewis and Clark at clayton.k12.mo.us. Tim, I hope that everything's going well for you out there in Montana, and I hope the weather's nice there. We're eager to get there next year. Thanks to everyone who's joined us, students and teachers, and our regular audience out there who's joined us. Thank you to all the folks at Apple who continue to host us through Apple Learning Interchange, and thanks to all of our colleagues back in Clayton School District in Clayton, Missouri. Until we see you next time, we proceed on.